Hi, this is Heather Meeker. This is a presentation about licensing and business models for commercial open source software companies. I'm a lawyer and a venture capitalist, and in both respects, I specialize in open source software licensing. In this presentation, I'm going to outline some of the considerations that might interest you. And in this presentation, I'd like to help you concretely visualize your business and licensing model for open source software. This presentation is a little bit more detailed and, shall we say, advanced than most of my other presentations on open source software licensing that you might see on YouTube. So bear with me, and I hope I will make it worth your while. Let's get started. The first thing to understand about this is that a license model and a business model are not exactly the same thing. Lots of people come to me and say, what open source license should I choose for my product? And that's really not quite the right question. You have to figure out your business model first, and once you do that, I promise the licensing model will fall into line. So first we need to distinguish licensing models and business models. The business model is the way that you're going to make money and sell great products to customers. The license model is the legal mechanism by which you're going to make that happen. Now, if you're listening to this presentation, you may already know that open source is big business. Open source licenses are free of charge, of course, but that doesn't mean you can't build a business around an open source project. What's on this screen right now is the Commercial Open Source Software Index. This is an index maintained by my venture capital firm, Open Source Software Capital, and it just outlines all of the companies that have had significant exits in recent years that are commercial open source software companies. And what I mean by that is that these companies wouldn't exist except for the open source project that they are building on top of. Some of these exits are really quite impressive, so it's perfectly feasible to make a business out of an open source software project, but you have to do a little bit of thinking about what your business model is going to be. And if you want to take a look at the most recent copy of this index, I'm going to put the link in the comments on this video so that you can take a look at the most recent one. This version of the index is just the one that existed when I made this video. Here are some of the most recent examples of businesses that have had significant exits, and I know you're going to recognize most of these. Some of the biggest are, of course, Red Hat, which had a very large acquisition. It was sold to IBM a few years ago. Others that you might recognize, either because they've gone public or they are extremely successful companies or they've been acquired, would be MongoDB, GitHub, Elastic, and Rackspace, all companies you've heard of. But these companies all had slightly different business models. There are a lot of ways to make money using open source software. One of the mistakes that some open source businesses make when they're starting out is to engage in a little bit of magical thinking. And the example I've used here are the Underpants Gnomes from South Park. They had a 3-phase plan to make lots of money. Phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 3, profit, but they couldn't say what was in between. And sometimes when I talk to open source business founders, they tend to be thinking a little bit like this. Instead, you have to have a clear path to translating your successful open source project into a business. Having stars and getting attention is great, but it's not a business. There is an extra step that you have to engage in to take your business from an open source project to an actual business initiative. So now we're going to talk about those business models. And while there are a lot of different business models, they're all kind of variations on a theme. and we call that the razor blades model. That model is one that was pioneered by Gillette Razor, and it says, give them the razor, sell them the razor blades. In other words, you're giving something away in order to create a market for something else. In a razor blades model, people get a lot of benefit from what's getting given away to them, but they pay for the things that the company needs in order to have a sustainable revenue model. And open source companies all work like this. They give something away, which is the open source software, in order to sell something else. And the question of what is that something else is the basic question that we have to ask to figure out how a commercial open source software company makes its money. Now we're going to talk about the various business models. The first one is the maintenance and support model, and this one should be the most familiar because it's the one that lots of open source companies have used over the years. The most obvious example of this is probably something like Red Hat, but I'm going to explain in a moment that that kind of business model is perhaps a little bit different. Maintenance and support means that you give away the open source software, and by the way, that open source software project may be one that you're running, or it may be one that someone else is running. But what you're selling is maintenance and support. Mostly support, of course, because maintenance in an open source software project really is kind of free. People get updates for free if the software is really being developed in a true open source development model. But what actually costs money to get is support, because those are human services. So some companies make their business model by giving personal support to install software, to configure it, and to make sure it's updated, and help desk and so forth. Now, the thing about this business model is that conventional wisdom holds that a support business model is hard to scale. In other words, it requires human resources, and it requires more human resources to do more business. So this is not one of the most popular business models, but it is a pretty easy business model to understand for open source, and it was the business model that most early commercial open source software companies started with. By the way, when we say it doesn't scale, that is kind of code for you won't be able to get investors. And the reason for that is that many investors have a calculus of what returns they want to get on their money that is not considered consistent with a business that is so reliant on human services that it's hard to scale. Now let's talk about quality assurance. So I think this is a more accurate representation of the business model of companies like Red Hat. And the reason is that people get Red Hat software because they trust the Red Hat brand. In other words, what a company like Red Hat is doing is taking open source software, which in their case is Linux kernel and a lot of other software that goes into a distro, and making sure that there's quality assurance when the product is built and delivered. So this is actually a viable business model for commercial open source companies. And what you're adding perhaps is not exactly software, but you're adding the human quality assurance and the human knowledge of putting the software together properly, because source code is not a product. Source code is just a tool to build a product. And while there may not be a huge gulf between a source code form of software and an executable form of software, there is some difference between them. In order to get from A to B, you need build engineers and you need other people who have the human skills necessary to put a product together. So quality assurance is a good business model for open source software companies. By the way, the picture there is the pet rock, which was a fad in the 1970s. And you'll see it's just a rock with eyeballs on it, but it's in a nice little package with a nice brand. And by the way, for that particular product, there was actually a lot of quality assurance. The rocks came from a particular beach in Mexico, and they had a particular shape and size. And they were just a rock with eyeballs, but on the other hand, somebody had exercised the care to make sure it was a viable product. So this is similar to what's happening with the quality assurance model. By the way, you might have heard people say there's only one red hat. And what they mean by that is that it can be difficult to build a business using this model. That's because although this model can be scalable, its margins are usually on the thin side. So what happened with Red Hat is it benefited from the fact that Linux is basically the most popular open source project in the world. And when people say there's only one, what they mean is that it doesn't make sense to have lots of Linux distributions, and also that most projects just don't have the reach that the Linux project has. A different kind of open source business model is online services. Now you'll see here as examples the logos of GitHub and WordPress, and these are two very successful businesses that have made their business out of providing online services powered by an open source software project. In the case of GitHub, that's the Git collaboration tool, which was not developed by GitHub. In the case of WordPress.com, it's the WordPress platform, which was developed by the founder of WordPress.com. So in these situations, you're actually making an online service available with software that anyone could run on their own. And then the question is, why don't they run it on their own? Why wouldn't they just run it on their own and not pay you to provide it to them online? In the case of GitHub, what happens is that there is an incredible network effect to having so many people on the platform. In the case of WordPress, the primary customers are small to medium businesses who might not have the skill or the desire to stand up an instance of the software on their own. So these are two online business models that actually operate quite differently. The next model is professional services, and this business model is not terribly common, again because it's hard to scale, because it requires human resources. But there are businesses that make their livings customizing open source software for customers. And I would say this usually happens in the embedded software space. So if you want, for instance, a custom version of Linux to operate on an IoT device, you might go to a company that does custom Linux development in order to get that project done. Here, the software is usually actually not developed by the company that's doing the professional development services, although sometimes it is. But the important thing to understand is that what is being sold are the professional development services, not the software at all. The software is freely available to anyone. The next model is called Widget Frosting, and really what that means is that the company is selling a hardware device, like an IoT device or maybe a computer or consumer electronics device. So what the company is selling is the actual hardware product, and then they use the open source software to power it. By the way, this is kind of the flip side of the professional development services model, because the company is using some standard open source software. Maybe it's customized a little bit, but they're selling a custom device. So the company is selling hardware devices and giving away the software for free. One thing to note about businesses like this is that their revenue and profit models are really quite different from software businesses. These businesses involved a lot of operations, supply chain control, and so forth. So they're really quite different, and their margins usually tend to be much smaller. The average margin in a hardware business can be very low. The average margin in a software business is usually pretty healthy. So a hardware business might typically be a few % profit on a product, a software product usually has a profit margin of 10, 15, 20, 25%. This next model is what I call the embargo model. And this one is also not terribly common, but the idea is that the company makes its latest and best open source software development available actually under proprietary licenses. And then when it gets to its next version, it makes the prior version available under an open source license. So what it's doing is it's time shifting the access to the open source software to its paying customers. Technically, what's happening here is that before the code gets released under an open source license, it's given to customers under some kind of limited license or proprietary license. And then it rolls into open source when the company decides it should. By the way, there are companies that do this, and the model is not really all that transparent. That's because the open source software just isn't released until a later date, and there might not be much visibility into that. One of the corollaries of this, though, is that the open source software is not developed entirely in the open. And for this reason, some people say this is not a true open source development model. But the software does get released under an open source license. One of the variations of this, by the way, is the MariaDB business source license. That is a license that has an automatic conversion to an open source license. It has to be a license that's compatible with GPL2. And so this business model can actually be embodied in the license or not. Here's a summary of all these business models, and you'll see there are a couple more at the end, and I'm going to talk about those next because those are implemented a lot more closely to their licensing models. So for maintenance and support, you have the open source software, and the upsell is actual services. There's no additional license. For quality assurance, you have the open source software, and the upsell is services. There are no additional software licenses granted, similar to maintenance and support. For online services, you have the open source software. What's being upsold is the actual online access to the software. And some companies that have this model use their own proprietary software that they don't make generally available in order to serve up and perhaps manage the open source software that they're making available online. So with respect to those additional pieces, there is actually no license being granted, but what's being sold is online access. Professional services, again, you've got the open source software, and usually in a professional services arrangement, the customer gets an assignment or ownership of the license rights to whatever is developed. There's widget frosting, and that's a situation where the company, what they're upselling is the actual hardware device, and there's no additional license beyond the open source software license. In the embargo model, there are two licenses, but they're time shifted. What's being upsold is early access under a proprietary license. The next two models I'm going to talk about in a moment. They are dual licensing, where there are actually two different kinds of licenses available, and open core, which is a variation on dual licensing. So actually, the most common business model that we're seeing today in the commercial open source software world is open core. It is the model to which most companies have gravitated within the last 10 years or so. I'm going to talk about those in a moment. So now let's move on to talking about licensing models, because the dual licensing and open core models are really very closely effectuated through their licensing models. First, I'd like to talk about dual licensing, and I'm going to talk about this first because it is a little bit simpler, and then I'm going to talk about open core. In fact, as I mentioned, open core is the more common licensing model. Dual licensing was pretty popular in the early 2000s to late 2000s. It has become less popular over the years. So if you talk about the classic dual licensing model, that was pioneered by MySQL. Now, MySQL is database, and it was under a variation of GPL. And the licensing model says, here's a software. It's usually under a license like GPL or AGPL. And if you want to use this, but you don't want to abide by the terms of the open source license, then you can buy an alternative commercial license. This is sometimes referred to as selling exceptions. So in the classic dual licensing model, like for MySQL, if I wanted to develop a product that used MySQL and I wanted to distribute it, I would have to buy my way out of the GPL license conditions if I wanted my product to remain proprietary. So businesses made a good business model out of that for a while. The thing is that model was mostly predicated upon the fact that they were licensing under GPL, and you couldn't comply with GPL and build a proprietary application and distribute it. As the world moved over from distributed software to software as a service, that model lost a lot of its teeth, and that's one reason why it is not as popular anymore. By the way, the classic dual licensing model is represented on that slide by the very cute babies who are identical twins. Dual licensing then moved into something that was more like a fraternal twin model, and that in turn developed into open core. So the fraternal twin model, which is represented by the other picture, is where the product is available under two different licenses, but the version of the product that's available under the proprietary or commercial license, as opposed to the one that's available under the open source license, they're slightly different. Classic dual licensing really means the exact same product is available under two different licenses. The fraternal twin model was generally when a company would add some upsell elements and create a different version. So originally, and still somewhat, you see the open source version being called a community version or open source or free version. And the other version that has the upsell elements is often called an enterprise version. And by the way, those additional elements are often the elements necessary to run the software at scale. So what that means is that by proxy, through this licensing model, the companies were giving the software away to smaller users and selling it to bigger users. Now let's move on to open core. As you can see, open core looks pretty similar to the fraternal twin dual licensing model. What open core means is that there is a core element of the product that is open source. It's often referred to as like an engine or a core or a platform. And then there are add-ons, which are often plugins. They might be code that surrounds or supplements the core. And those elements are only available under proprietary licenses. This model looks very similar to the fraternal twin model of dual licensing. The difference being that usually in the dual licensing model, you've got a version of the product under entirely proprietary terms and another version of the product under entirely open source terms. The open core model actually sort of bifurcates the licensing terms. So the core is under the open source license no matter what, even if you also buy the proprietary pieces. The proprietary pieces are sold under normal proprietary licenses. So you can see here an example of the core of open source software and the proprietary add-ons. And like for the fraternal twin model of dual licensing, those add-ons are usually elements of the software that make it easier to use the software at scale. Open core models can come in all sizes and shapes. You can see a few different metaphors here. I'd say the standard open core model would be represented by the avocado. There's a sort of a medium-sized core surrounded by potentially a healthy amount of proprietary software. On the other side, you see the orange. That's where the core is almost all of the product, but the proprietary elements are, usually glue that hooks the software into maybe other software packages and so forth, but the core represents most of the value. And then the pomegranate there represents a situation where you might have actually a bunch of cores under the open source license and then interspersed with elements of proprietary code. They're all different kinds of variations of open core. Now I'm going to pause here for a moment so that you can think, what are your razor blades? For your own particular open source project, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about online services? Are you thinking about hardware devices? Are you thinking about an open core model, dual licensing, maintenance and support, etc.? So take a moment now to think about it before you go on to watch the rest of the presentation, which talks about licensing models. And by the way, not only are these not the only choices, but you can mix and match them. It's a little bit different for every company, so you have to think about what your product is and what value you're going to create in order to sell products to your customers. And that's not quite the same question as what value you are creating for your customers generally, because all open source businesses leave a lot on the table. They give away a lot of value in order to capture a smaller amount of value. So your question for your business model is, 1, what are you giving away? And 2, what are you charging for? Both those things are valuable. Okay, now let's talk about some of the open source licenses that you might choose for your model, now that you've settled on your model. I'm not going to spend a lot of time about this in this presentation because there is plenty of other material that you can look at to choose an open source license, including on my website, which is at heathermeeker.com. There's a license picker that you might find fun or interesting to use to try to choose a license. And I'll put the link to that down below in the comments here. But I wanted to talk about the open source licenses a little bit so you can get a sense of how you might choose one and how that dovetails with your business model. Okay, there's a lot of information packed into this slide, but as you can see here, this lists a number of licenses, open source licenses, and versions of those licenses. I would say that these are the only licenses that you should usually choose to implement any kind of business model. And the reason for that is that these are the most popular licenses. One of the things that you're trying to accomplish with an open source release is to maximize adoption of the software and to make it easy for people to understand the license terms and to choose to use your software. If you pick an obscure open source license, then you're pretty much at odds with that goal. And so I don't recommend choosing any but these. These are by far the most popular ones. You'll see that on this slide, on one side, the left-hand side, there are licenses I call Linux kernel compatible. So that's GPL2, LGPL 2.1, BSD, and MIT. These are licenses that you have to choose if you want your software to be compatible with the Linux kernel. In other words, if you want it to go in the Linux kernel, you can't choose any of the ones on the right. I'll make one exception later there. On the right-hand side, you'll see those are the licenses that have patent grants. In other words, those licenses have specific language that grants patent licenses to people using the software. Now, the actual difference between the patent rights that might be granted on the right or the left may be less than you think, but lots of people who are using software want some comfort that you, the licensor of the software, aren't going to assert any patents against them. And that's why they might prefer a license on the right-hand side. And this really comes up a lot when you're making a choice between permissive licenses like BSD or MIT, which have no patent language in them, and Apache, which has an express license grant in them. But perhaps the most important thing about this picture is that this lays out the licenses from permissive to weak copyleft to strong copyleft to ultra strong copyleft. And the way that you deploy your business model will have teachings for which form of license you're going to choose, how protective it is. So a permissive license allows anybody to do anything they like with the software. And obviously, this will be the choice to maximize immediate adoption of the software. But these licenses do nothing to prevent other people from free riding on what you're doing. The copyleft licenses can have some effect to prevent people from privatizing what you do, because they require that if people distribute software under the license, that they share their changes in source code form. So particularly for distributed products, like let's say IoT devices or mobile apps and so forth, these copyleft licenses might have the effect of preventing people from freely writing on what you're doing. This decision can be a little complicated, and it is very dependent on the facts of your particular product. So take a look at the license picker. One thing to consider is that if your open source product is a library and you pick a weak copyleft license like LGPL or Mozilla, that will not have any effect to drive people towards commercial licenses in a dual licensing model, because those licenses will only require people to share changes within the library that you're selling and not the applications that they're building using the library. So most dual licensing models tend towards GPL or AGPL. They use GPL for distributed products and AGPL for online services. But I'll just tell you overall where people usually come out on this. If you are actually seeking patents on your software, as well as releasing it open source, and whether you want to do that is a separate decision, you probably want to pick one of the licenses that has an express patent grant. But if you want to maximize adoption, you're probably going to pick a permissive license. If you want to maximize competitive protection, you're going to pick a copyleft license like GPL or AGPL. If you need Linux compatibility, you have to pick something that is compatible with GPL too. And right at the bottom, I said if you need both Linux compatibility and patent grants, you can pick MPL2, because MPL2 has this built-in feature that says anyone who wants to use the code under GPL2 can do that. So it's sort of a way of making the software available for a GPL2 project. But I'll say overall that almost all open source releases by companies that are deploying commercial open source software business models are under Apache 2 or one of the permissive licenses. Why? Because the objective of releasing the code is to get people to adopt the software quickly and join your community, and it's much easier to do that with a permissive license than with a copyleft license. Okay, I'm back on the open core slide here, because what I'd like to talk about is if you're deploying an open core model, which uses multiple licenses, you're going to have to pick more than one license. As you can see, there's an open source license for the core, but the add-ons have to be some other kind of license that will allow you to charge for those add-on pieces. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of licenses you might choose. Of course, you can choose a kind of traditional end user license or enterprise software license. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those because I think we're all familiar with what those are. They're custom written agreements where the user takes a limited license to the software, sometimes based on the number of users or servers or enterprise-wide or what have you. Those are pretty standard kinds of software licenses. What I would like to talk about here, though, are the source available licenses, because these are licenses that are growing in popularity, particularly for companies that are deploying an open core model. A source available license is a license that makes source code available, but it's not an open source license. And the reason it's not is that it doesn't grant all the rights that are granted in open source software licenses. Open source software licenses, by definition, allow people to do anything they want with the software. That's a very important quality of them. There are no restrictions on what you can do. If you do certain things like distribute, you might have to do other things like share source code, but there is no limitation on what you can do. Source available licenses are free of charge, and they are source code licenses, but they don't allow you to do certain things. And those certain things that they don't allow you to do are the things that the licensor who's deploying the business model wants to reserve for itself as a way to monetize their software product. To give you some context for this, here is a list of companies that you probably recognize, and I wanted to talk a little bit about their licensing models. If you look at a company like Redis or Confluent, those are companies that are deploying an open core model. So their core is under a permissive license, and the rest of the software is under a source available license. And those source available licenses basically say that you cannot use the software to stand up a competing software as a service. That way, those companies are reserving for themselves the ability to deploy that business model as part of their open core model and monetize software as a service. If you look at companies like Mongo and Grafana, on the other hand, those companies are doing something slightly different, which is more like a dual licensing model. And as you can see, they use different options like SSPL, which is kind of a souped up form of AGPL that is not approved by OSI as an open source license. AGPL, which is a strong copyleft or network copyleft license, and Elastic 2.0, which is a source available license. So as you can see, all these companies have slightly different approaches to their open core model. Another option, which I mentioned before as part of the Embargo Model, is the business source license. And that is an unusual license that releases the software for non-production use, but effective on a change date which is specified in the license. The software license converts to a GPL compatible license. So this is another kind of variation of a source available license. The next option I wanted to mention to you is the PolyForm licenses. This is a software license drafting project that focuses on source available licenses, and it has a menu of choices that you might find interesting. All of the ones that I mentioned before were custom drafted licenses for companies like Confluent and Elastic. And the PolyForm licenses are template licenses that anyone can adopt free of charge. So you might want to take a look at this project. The PolyForm project was a drafting project that was done by a number of lawyers in the open source licensing space, including me. And it offers these choices that are a little bit similar to the Creative Commons licenses, if you're familiar with those. But it has options like non-commercial, internal use, free trial, and a couple of different forms of non-compete licenses that are a little bit more similar to, say, Confluent or Elastic. So you might want to check those out as an option if you're deploying a dual licensing model or if you're deploying an open core licensing model. And you'll see on the next slide, this just illustrates how you might combine a license like PolyForm non-commercial with an open core under a license like Apache 2. The premise here is that the company allows everyone to use the open core freely, but the upsell elements can only be used for non-commercial purposes. Anyone who wants to use the upsell elements for commercial purposes has to come back to negotiate a commercial license with the licensor. Well, that's it for this brief presentation. I hope you found it interesting. Before I conclude, here's some information about how to get a free copy of my book on open source licensing. It's called Open Source for Business, and you just have to go to my website, sign up for a mailing list that is only for book updates, and it'll give you instructions on how to download a PDF copy of the book. You can also buy it on Amazon if you want a paper copy. It's not expensive. I also like to mention my venture capital firm, which is Open Source Software Capital, and we specialize in investing in early stage commercial open source software companies. Thank you very much for your attention. I know this was a lot of information. I hope you found it helpful anyway. If you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm easy to find. And I encourage you to go out there and turn your open source project into a really successful business. Good luck.